Welcome back. We are looking at Business Math B Unit 5. We're going to move forward to Lesson 23, Interpreting Cost and Revenue Graphs. Before we get there, two key vocabulary terms, break-even analysis and break-even point. So break-even analysis is a study to find the number of units that must be manufactured to exactly match production expenses. So as you can imagine, if I want to produce some item, initially I'm going to have to invest some money in it, right? I'm not going to just be making profit on day one. So initially I'm investing costs, whether that is cost of labor, cost of goods, whatever. Break-even analysis is saying, okay, well, how long is it going to take me? How many units of this item am I going to have to sell before I break even, before I just recuperate my initial investment costs, okay? So again, break-even analysis is the actual study to figure that out. The break-even point is the result of the study. So the study tells you, okay, well, your break-even point is X. You have to sell this many units in order for your income from sales to equal the cost that you put into it. So at the break-even point, this is when your net profit is 0. Okay? So every unit you sell after the break-even point is when you start to make a profit. And if you don't ever sell as many units as the break-even point, then you're never going to make a profit. So again, break-even analysis is the actual study to find the break-even point. So in your lesson, you'll see quite a few graphs that you're asked to interpret. Don't be intimidated by this. For the most part, we're just going to need to be able to read graphs, look at intersection points, okay? So for example, imagine that you're given this question and it asks you to find the approximate revenue when 6 units are sold. So before you just dive in and try to answer, take a moment to kind of organize and inspect the graph. So notice that the x-axis represents number of units sold, and the y-axis represents money. Now we have two lines plotted here, so we need to know what both of those represent. In red, we have costs. So notice that this makes sense. Look at the initial cost is above 0 because we had to invest some money to get started, right? And then green is revenue, and this again makes sense. Notice that initially the revenue was 0. We started off having sold 0 units, okay? So over time, anywhere you see cost, my cost line above my revenue means that my net profit is still in the red, right? Until these equal each other, the project has still cost me more than it has earned me, okay? So at any point, I can analyze and I can say, okay, at 2 units, I have made this much money, but I have invested that much money, right? And so on and so forth. So we want to get to a point, obviously, where your revenue, the money you're making, is greater than your cost. Otherwise, what's the point of this project? And now we'll get into examples where we look at different elements of the graph. So for now, let's just stick to what we've been asked to look at, which is the approximate revenue when 6 units are sold. So first, note that it is asking us to look at revenue, which is the green line. I'll look at 6 units. So I'm just going to kind of draw a line here so that it's easier to see. 6 units seems to hit right about here. So the revenue at that point would just be the quantity that I'm hitting on the y-axis, which looks to be about $408. So again, the question was, what is the approximate revenue when 6 units are sold? So I looked at my revenue graph. I found the point on the graph that represents 6 units, and then I read the y value for that given x value of 6 units, and the y value was $408, so that's my answer. Notice that I didn't mess around with the cost graph at all for this question. Okay, let's look at another example. So same graph, but what if this time they asked you to find the approximate cost when 6 units are sold? Well, we would take a similar approach. We know that cost is our graph in red, so they are asking us to look at 6 units and determine the y value. So basically, every ordered pair, x, y on this graph, x is the number of units, right? And y is money. So So what they're saying is, given this x value of 6, what's the y value when we're looking at the cost graph? So if I find 6 seems to hit right about there, so the corresponding y value is $543. So the cost at 6 units is approximately $543. Okay, let's move forward. So far we've calculated the cost when 6 units are sold. We've calculated the revenue when 6 units are sold. Now we're asked for net profit. So in this case, our net profit is going to be our revenue minus our costs. So in total, when you take into account the money we've made and the money we've lost, where do we stand? So remember, we're looking at 6 units. We had already identified that our revenue, in fact, let me change colors here. We've already identified that our revenue is 408. And we're going to subtract off our costs, which we identified as 543 in our last example. So to find net profit, essentially what that's asking you to do is to find the difference between those two numbers. So you could think of it, you could take these numbers from the graph and then set up an equation like this and solve. I think that comes out to negative 135. So we've lost $135 so far. But you could also think of it as just looking at the distance on the graph from point to point, right? So I have this point at 543, I have the next point at 408, and the reason I'm looking at those is because that's where my graph hits 6 units, right? And so you could just ask yourself, okay, well, what's the distance at 6 units between the red line and the green line? Okay, so our net profit, again, is comparing our revenue and costs, and we find that so far we are at negative 135. Another type of question you might see, it might ask you, at the break-even point, what are the revenues? At the break-even point, what are the revenues? Well, first we need to know what the break-even point is. And remember, from the definition of a break-even point, that was going to be where our revenue was equal to our cost, right? If we were to add them together, if we had revenue, subtract them, revenue minus cost, we would get $0, right? So this is where we have neither lost money nor made money. So where is that happening? Well, it would have to be where their dollar amounts were equal, right? And remember, on this graph, dollars are what's being represented on the y-axis and units are on the x-axis. So it stands to reason that if we're looking for a point where our dollar values are the same, we need to find the point where the graphs intersect, where their y values are the same. And you can see that happens right here. Okay, so it happens at a value of 157,483. And the units at that point are, let's see, looks like it's hitting right about there, which would be roughly 1,750 units. So now, here's what we have to distinguish. I have figured out that the break-even point occurs at the value of, and let me just change color here. We break even when we hit 1,750 units, which the y value there is 157,483. So which one of these things is the break-even point? Well, the break-even point refers specifically to the number of units, okay? So break-even point should be given in units. So break-even point is 1,750 units. The break-even point is not the dollar amount in this case, okay? Unless it specifically asks. So again, break-even point is the number of units. But we still haven't answered the question, which was what are the revenues at the break-even point, and that would be the 157,483. Okay. At the break-even point, what are the revenues? The revenues are 157,483. So be really careful when you're answering these questions, whether it's asking you for the break-even point, in which case you're telling them a number of units, or if they ask you for revenue or cost, in which case you should be reporting dollars. And again, notice that my answer is 157,483 and not 0, okay? Because it asked me at the break-even point, what are the revenues? So I have made 483 dollars off of these units. That's true. That is my revenue. Okay, so it might be tempting to do to say $0 because you know that your net profit is 0. But again, your revenue is 157,483. This company will begin to make a profit after producing more than blank units. So this is related to our last question. We know that the company will begin making a profit after the break-even point, right? So after they break even, they can start making money. We found last time that the break-even point occurred at about 1,750 units. So your answer would be 1,750. And the reason it's 1,750 and not 1,751 is that the wording of it. So it says, this company will begin to make a profit after producing more than 1,750. Okay, and those are all the examples we're going to look at for today. So from here, just like before, continue forward to the asynchronous questions and activities related to this section. I'll see you guys next time.